Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Learn why it is paramount to be an educated investor today compared with generations past. Learn about the prospects for a double-dip recession and get an informed opinion from our guest on how long inflation is going to last and how you need to position yourself as a real estate investor for all of this too. It's my conversation with the president of the Mises Institute. Also, I have an announcement to make today on Get Rich Education. Checkbook IRAs have been ruled illegal by the U.S. tax court, with contribution limits 10 times what traditional and Roth IRAs allow. Get total control of all of your IRA funds without paying the nasty UBIT tax with the retirement plan answer left standing, the eQRP. You can invest your retirement funds in real estate, gold, Bitcoin, and even your own business. This works whether you're a solopreneur or have up to 50 employees. Learn more about getting started. Text eQRP in all caps to 72,000. The annual Spartan Summit is on. I was the kickoff speaker at the last event. This year they are back in person, and the keynote speaker is none other than Shark Tank's Daymond John. Learn from industry experts on real estate, tax strategy, lending, and entrepreneurship. You'll also get to tour tangible turnkey income property in growing Alabama markets. It's coming February 16th to 18th in Birmingham, Alabama. Get your ticket or learn more at SpartanInvest.com today.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from St. Louis, Missouri to Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, and across 188 nations worldwide. You're listening to one of America's longest-running investing shows. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. Here at GRE, I've spent more than 7 years helping you build a nationwide income property portfolio. And somewhere along the way, you may very well have updated your LinkedIn profile with the title Real Estate Investor. You might have had at least one friend just kind of gently suggest you stop talking about the inflation triple crown so much, or always mentioning how leverage beats compound interest. What this really does is it makes it clear that you are winning the game of plutology. Yeah, plutology. That means the study of wealth. So before I discuss the future and more with our guest, let's recap how what happened last year affects you today. You have got a lot of reasons to celebrate. Namely, what's happened in the past year is near 20% year-over-year national home price growth and a new American homeowner equity record of, wait for it, $294,000 per household. Yes, understand that recently the median priced American home was $294K. Now that is the homeowner's average equity position, $294K. Yeah. And although we're cash flow centric here, most of a real estate investor's net worth gains come from equity growth. So equity, property value minus mortgage owed, that actually represents 2 of real estate's 5 profit centers. Those 2 are appreciation and tenant-made principal paydown. But let me acknowledge that last year surely was not a great year for everyone. You probably remember where you were during January 6th's Capitol insurrection, and that was so dispiriting. I would rather think of that as the day that I had my first hike in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. That was the best part of that day for me. President Joe Biden was sworn in 2 weeks later on January 20th. He accomplished a number of his priorities, actually, like signing a bipartisan infrastructure bill into law and overseeing a faster economic recovery. Oh, but yet on July 4th, Biden declared that America had achieved independence from COVID-19. Whoops, more Americans died of the virus in 2021 than in 2020. Yeah, last year was the second full calendar year of the pandemic, and it's like each time we made progress toward normalcy, a new variant beats us down, and vaccine mandates became more polarizing than cilantro or raw onions. But there are promising signs overall. Quarantine times are being reduced. The lockdown era appears to be over, and COVID pills sound promising. High inflation and supply chain disruptions were perhaps best represented by those long lines of cargo ships waiting outside the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, California. And the work from home trend helped make those home prices soar, like I already talked about. Mortgage loan forbearance and eviction moratoriums have largely unwound. And, those phenomena, they were not as bad as lay people think. As real estate investors, we know that often to get eviction protection at all, a tenant had to specifically document that they lost their job due to COVID, not for other reasons, in order to get that eviction protection. And then they could still be evicted for most any other reason. And on top of that, we typically focus our investing in the Midwest and South, business-friendly and landlord-friendly places where even if a tenant did try to get eviction protection due to COVID, a lot of judges just dismissed that, basically saying, no, the CDC can't do that. And that is why I, as an investor, was relatively unscathed with those developments, and hopefully you were too. I am going to ask our guest more about that today. At some point, this whole thing is likely going to transition from a pandemic into an endemic virus, and then everyone can return to talking about some of those things that we discussed before we even knew what the word pandemic meant. And can you even remember what those things were? I almost forget. It has been a while. So, well, let's get back to the real estate party. With your astounding equity growth over the past year, now you are in a position to give to the less fortunate if you want to. And we say fortunate, but often it's really the less intentional. And if you've been following my financially free beats debt-free plan, you have been intentional, expanding your means rather than live below them. You are not living the life of your fears. You are living the life of your dreams, because nationally, in just the past year, there has been, get ready for this, $56,700 of equity growth per property. Yeah, $56,700 of equity growth per property. Now, before you take that number and multiply it by the number of properties that you own in celebration, let's remember that your income properties, they tend to be lower priced and in more affordable states. So perhaps it's somewhere between $30K and $45K of average equity growth for each one of your income properties in just the last year. So take that number of average equity growth per property and multiply it by the number of properties you have. Tally up your wins. That is a windfall. So sure, more equity has made your net worth balloon handsomely in the past year. And in a sense, it is kind of unusual to mark wealth with equity. As I have long taught you, your return from home equity is always zero. Inflation debases equity as well, but what you can do is convert your equity into cash flow. That is the financial freedom formula after all. So celebrate this moment. If you've been actionable and you've been buying property through GRE's network for more than 7 years now, you are winning. You are celebrating. I am going to celebrate by visiting Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands soon. However you do it, congratulations. Speaking of property through our network, the announcement that I have is that GRE Turnkey is being phased out. This is to connect with providers for cash flowing property and more. What you do is go to the new GRE Marketplace and create an account. Yeah, we changed the name of where you go for property that meet GRE's wealth formula and philosophy. It is gremarketplace.com because it's more than just turnkeys, although it's still predominantly turnkeys. There are also resources there in case you want to get in on the real estate lending side or find agricultural cash flowing property and more. See, in our old system, if you wanted to be sent market reports from, say, 3 providers, it worked, but you would have to indicate your interest in 3 different places. And now it is all combined into one GRE Marketplace. Once you've registered there, you can set up a profile if you want to, but you have access to all of our turnkey providers and other providers, including sample properties and pro formas, and of course the provider's contact information. And on top of that, Andrea, that runs operations here at GRE, she has something really nice for you inside GRE Marketplace. She shot videos with many of the property managers in these markets, interviewing them. This way, you can see if the property management company for their rental properties resonate with you before you go ahead and add more property to your portfolio in that market. And that is important because, as I like to say, the market and the manager are both even more important than your rental property itself. So that is the big announcement today. Take the real estate knowledge that you have, make it actionable, and build real wealth. Go to gremarketplace.com, register, and get started there. Inflation is just one reason why you love being a real estate investor. How's this for an inflation measure? You must remember this. You know, I think that was only on a few select sandwiches that were $5 back there when that commercial played around the year 2010 in the United States. And if you're Canadian, I don't know if they had that offer there. But the next time that you're in Subway, just compare $5 then to what you need to pay today. And plus, they likely ask you for a tip now, and they didn't back in 2010. But that right there, what it is it's a great informal inflation measure for you. Coming up here on the GRE podcast, I told you weeks ago that we're going to be stacked with a ton of great shows here this year. One show that will stand out because I think it's so different is an upcoming episode on teenage financial independence. Yeah, that almost sounds like it doesn't go together. That's part of what makes it interesting. Teenage financial independence. That's in the future. Let's chat with today's guest. Today's guest is the president of the Mises Institute, where he serves as a writer, public speaker, and an advocate for property, markets, and civil society. He previously worked as a longtime advisor and chief of staff to Congressman Ron Paul, for whom he wrote hundreds of speeches and articles. And in his years with Dr. Paul, he worked with countless grassroots activists and organizations dedicated to reducing the size and scope of government. He also spent many years as a tax attorney advising private equity clients on mergers and acquisitions. It's an honor to welcome in President of the Mises Institute, Jeff Deist.
Hey, thanks a lot, Keith.
For those of you listening in the audio-only format, Deist is spelled D-E-I-S-T. Jeff, when I think about the Mises Institute, what comes to mind is a think tank that champions free markets and property rights. Is that really part of the core mission there, Jeff?
Well, it certainly is. Right now, we find ourselves in a very strange time when we've got a lot of shifting fundamentals just with markets, but also politically. Left and right have become terms that don't have the same meaning that they once had. And from my perspective anyway, at least in my opinion, fiscal and monetary policy is a much bigger player in the marketplace, whether that's real estate or otherwise, than it ought to be. I think we live in a time where, especially if you're involved in investing, especially if you're out there trying to be entrepreneurial, you're out there putting your own capital at risk. You're trying to get a return, which you're not going to get in savings accounts, for example, or CDs or money markets. You really have to understand some fundamentals. And I think it's dangerous to be out there as an active business person or an investor without some of those fundamentals. That doesn't mean economics is enough. Economics is not sufficient, but it's certainly one of the foundations you have to have in your own personal knowledge, I think, to be successful. And it's the kind of thing, as with so many other things in life, you have to really apply yourself to lifetime learning. You're never there, but with a little bit of smarts, I think you can understand the world today and markets today a lot better, if for no other reason than to understand that the only return that matters is not just the return net of taxes or investment fees, whatever, it's net of inflation.
Yeah.
That's the return that matters. And in a world where not only monetary inflation, but even price inflation is going up and up and up, you have a lot of money which is flowing out of cash and into equity markets and into real estate markets because people have to try to find yield and protect themselves and their future. And so I hope that the Mises Institute serves as kind of a free school for people to come and learn more about what we consider the right kind of economics.
I think it's easy to make the argument that it's more important for one to be an educated investor today than it used to be. To your point, you can't get a real yield in being a saver. I mean, classic savers in the pure sense of the word in a CD or a savings account are obviously having their purchasing power erode to inflation, and you can't get a real yield there anyway. Of course, we've been in a stepped up inflation environment now where investing has become even more important. Part of that, and something that we champion here at Get Rich Education, is real estate investing, that vehicle that's made more ordinary people wealthy than anything else. But within the context of real estate investing, some real estate investors feel like with what happened in the economy beginning about 2 years ago and its resulting recession and all the aberrations in the economy, that some of those freedoms were somewhat taken away. And some real estate investors said, wait, the CDC can do something like that? And we persevered through mortgage loan forbearance and eviction moratoriums and so on. I don't know that that's really providing much of a climate for freedom that way. In fact, it's certainly not. So what were your thoughts from your perspective, Jeff, being the president of the Mises Institute, when you saw some of these not so free market interventions introduced by the government, like mortgage loan forbearance and eviction moratoriums? What are your thoughts?
Well, it just drives home for people how important a stable concept of property rights and a stable concept of contract rights are for a society that's going to function and that's going to create prosperity. I mean, when you come along and you change the rules midstream, that creates what economists call regime uncertainty. So all the things you were planning on as a business person or as a restaurateur or a real estate investor or whatever it might be, all of a sudden they're up in the air because you don't have the same certainty with respect to your rights under the law. So if you go out and buy property and you tell people they don't have to pay their rent for a period, you're effectively just shifting the burden from one group of people to another to bear the economic cost of something. And same with mortgage interest. I mean, say what you will about big commercial banks or mortgage companies. When people sign contracts with them and agree to a certain amount of interest, for example, that without that uncertainty, it makes the world a lot more expensive because you have to build in to contracts and you have to build into rent and you have to build into housing prices the costs of that future uncertainty. Because now, Keith, we have a new precedent set. What happens when the next virus comes along? What happens when the next 9/11 terrorist event happens? I mean, is government allowed to suspend rental payments whenever it cares to? And not just the government, but the CDC of all agencies. Why not the Fair Housing Authority? Or, you'd think this would come under some other department. So that's particularly bizarre. And so what that does is it creates a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty is bad for markets. And it requires investors and owners to price in a degree of risk. You don't know what's going to happen down the road. So it depends on what market you're looking at. But even rental markets, some rents are up 40% since COVID began. And we all know about this enormous exodus, people moving from certain states to others, which has occurred with a great relocation as a result of COVID. So that's radically altered housing markets. Sending people home from work and giving their employers PPP loans to make payroll is another distortion in the market. And of course, now companies are to grapple with the idea of remote work because precedent was set during COVID. There was already a work from home movement building in America even before. And now, especially with younger people looking at the work world and wanting more work-life balance or whatever it might be, that has huge implications for commercial real estate. All of those office buildings and office towers in Manhattan that we thought were going to be occupied forever and ever. And then, of course, all the retail space, all the luxe retail, which is hurting in places like San Francisco and Seattle and New York, all the giant malls, which were already on a fast downward trajectory as a result of Amazon and other online retailers. So you put all this together and it feels like COVID not only accelerated the pre-existing trends, but created all this regime uncertainty. And so that's going to make people more careful with their money. That's not going to be good for the economy in general. And sending the labor force home and paying them enhanced unemployment benefits is going to radically shift, I think, the landscape for businesses like restaurants and retail in particular, those lower paid hourly jobs. It's a very uncertain time. And what people normally do when things are really uncertain is they try to find safe harbors of a sort. And one safe harbor is cash. Oftentimes during recessions or depressions or after shocks, people hold more cash. That's not looking so great in a time of maybe 6-7% consumer price inflation. So what's another safe harbor is real estate. We can't understand everything that's going to happen in the future, but what we can understand is that stuff, tangible things will continue to have value and they won't go to zero. And real estate, I think, falls in that category.
We think it's the best investment vehicle, and we have championed residential real estate here from day one in 2014. And fortunately, we have, because the home has become even more of the center of one's world with what happened beginning 2 years ago, because now the home isn't just shelter for someone and where they sleep. It also might be where they work and work out and homeschool children and do more gardening at home and so on. So it's certainly been good for us in that sense. But you touch on some things. What else do you think an individual real estate investor can do that owns residential property? As we've seen now, hopefully it's not a precedent-setting thing with this government intervention with things like mortgage loan forbearance and eviction moratoria. What else can an investor do with this uncertainty? You mentioned one thing, that they can buy in these sort of business-friendly states, which also tend to be landlord-friendly states, which is something that we tend to do here, Jeff, buying real estate in the Midwest and South. Are there any other actionable things that one can do to hedge themselves from uncertainty as a residential real estate investor in income property?
It's difficult, certainly. What we've seen over the past 20 or 30 years, really since Alan Greenspan, but it's accelerated since the crash of 2007 and 2008, is that interest rates are ultra low. That's good for buyers. It's not so good for savers. It's good for borrowers. When I say buyers, I mean borrowers in terms of real estate. But it's not a trend that I think you can fight. We have $30 trillion of US Treasury debt. And if interest rates, average interest rates on that Treasury debt, which are currently below 2% on average across all the various length maturities of Treasury debt, if that went to a historical norm of 5 to 8%, then interest on the national debt would triple, quadruple, and all of a sudden Congress every year would be grappling with over $1 trillion in interest payments. It would be the single biggest item in the federal government's budget. So Congress desperately does not want that to happen. And I think the Fed's going to accommodate that, which means I think the Fed will do almost everything in its power to keep interest rates low and to prop up equity markets and to a lesser extent, housing and real estate markets at the same time. So you're going to have to go out there and try to find ways to make more than inflation. And when inflation is 6 or 7%, that's very, very tough. So you're going to have to think of it, I think, in long-term planning rather than short-term mindset. That's always a good rule of thumb, I think, in this world, is to have a longer-term focus and to understand that debt, whether we like it or not, I don't personally like it, but debt's a tool. If you have 800 credit, that's a tool. And it's an instrument you ought to be using. You know, all those years, Dave Ramsey was telling everyone save 20% for that down payment. Well, okay, but in the last 2 years, I live in a bucolic little college town of Auburn, Alabama. In the last 2 years, houses have just about doubled. That's rising more quickly than you can save money. The people, I think, who try to sit on the sidelines are not going to fare too well in an inflationary environment that I think is coming. So your listeners are active. They're out there trying to think of the future, and they're investing in one area, namely real estate, where you could have your ups and downs, but there's always going to be inherent value in it. And as long as you can maintain or carry the level of debt you have to carry, then I think you probably come out of it on the other side better off than someone who is exclusively, let's say, in equities or something like that, where I think the valuations are far more out of whack with respect to the underlying value of some of these companies. There's always some underlying value to real estate. And the question just becomes now with this realignment, where is that value? I mean, we're finding that it's in places like Boise, Idaho, maybe more than it is in Manhattan.
Oh, Jeff, you bring up so many good points to my question about how can an investor position themselves in this environment. I think you're talking about being a savvy borrower. Inflation transfers wealth from lenders to borrowers. So we want to be on that borrower side, because when we have debt tied to cash flowing real estate, our debt service is completely outsourced to tenants. And of course, this is of an even greater advantage when mortgage interest rates are half of stated inflation. We are profiteers when we're savvy borrowers. Jeff and I are going to come back and talk more. I'm going to get his thoughts on how long he thinks inflation will persist. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Jeff Deist from the Mises Institute. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. You know, a lot of investors choose either cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market could provide both: Jacksonville, Florida. They've got 27% lower home prices and higher rents than the national median. Their market has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets over the last 30 years. Get positive cash flow today and above average appreciation for tomorrow. They often have available inventory in Jacksonville, if you can believe that. Start at cashflowandgrowth.com. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They've provided GRE listeners with more loans than anyone, and it's where I got my last few loans. They finance single-family income property up to fourplexes. They're the number one lender for beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Chaley Ridge personally, and get your custom plan for expanding your cash-flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com. You can get a 50-year-old house somewhere or buy a new one directly from the builder with tenant-resilient amenities already built in. With over 3,000 Florida units at different construction stages, they are exclusively for investors. President Wagner and Alaska and team also invest strongly in their own product. That's belief. Start at buildtorentdirect.com. That's build2rentdirect.com or text 407-927-5074.
This is the eQRP Company's Damian Lupo. The scarcity mentality is abundant, and the abundance mentality is scarce. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Jeff Deist. He is the president of the Mises Institute. You can learn more about them and what they do at Mises.org. That's MISES.org. Jeff, I think you have some particular thoughts about inflation, this continued diminished purchasing power of the dollar, which we've seen stepped up. We've had the CPI reported at over 5%. And then in more recent months, the CPI has gone over 6%. A lot of people joke with how that's calculated, that the real diminished purchasing power of the dollar is indeed greater than that. So what you can really say is the CPI is what the government will admit to effectively. So tell us more about your thoughts with inflation and how long you think inflation is going to last.
I think we're going to see real price inflation throughout the 2020s. I don't think they're going to be able to contain it being price inflation in the way they did after the 2000-2008 crash. If you go back and look at what was happening then, yes, the Fed on the monetary side created a lot of new money, and they used that money to buy assets, mostly treasury debt and mortgage-backed security debt from commercial banks. So what they basically did was they recapitalized a bunch of banks that were shaky as a result of their debt portfolios, and they took that stuff off of their books. But the thing is all that money that the Fed created and exchanged with those banks for their assets just became part of that bank's account with the Fed. In other words, those became bank reserves, and bank reserves are not lent out into the general public. So if you contrast that with what's happened since COVID, with the big stimulus bill under Trump back in March of 2020, and now what's probably going to be some version of the Biden Build Back Better bill, not only do you have the Fed doing all the same things it was doing back in 2007, 2008, but in spades, they've created more money in the last 2 years than existed in the entire United States history. So not only is the Fed doing the same things, but on the fiscal side, over with the Biden administration, the Trump administration, and Congress, they're spending money like never before. Now that money, that fiscal side money, unlike monetary policy and the Fed, that fiscal side money is direct spending by Congress into the economy. So we're talking about PPP loans. We're talking about stimulus checks. We're talking about infrastructure and Build Back Better. That is directly inflationary. So I don't think that the 2020s are going to see the same kind of inflation, price inflation numbers as the 2010s. I think they'll be much higher. And you don't need hyperinflation to ruin people. Just 5, 8, 10% a year over several years is enough to seriously hurt people who are depending on a pretty fixed income, let's say, or older people who have saved most of their lives and now don't have earned income anymore, but hope to just live off that savings. So that's scary. You have to be out there trying to do something, maybe not beat inflation, but at least stave off some of it. If you're losing 3% of your money a year instead of 10% of your money a year, in a sense, that's a victory of sorts. So that's the kind of environment I think we're in. So again, when money is becoming worth less and less every day, then stuff becomes worth more and more. I'm going to recommend a book to your listeners. It's called When Money Dies by a guy named Adam Ferguson, which is a pretty sobering account of hyperinflation in Weimar Germany and neighboring Austria during World War I, during that period. So that shows you what people went out and did to get stuff to have to either consume or to trade, as opposed to having dollars. And if you really want to have a little bit of inside scoop as to what that might look like today, check out news stories every day from Turkey.
Right,
Erdogan
with what's happening with the lira.
A crazy campaign to devalue the Turkish lira and keep interest rates low. And this is all because Turkey borrowed heavily in the 2010s in dollars and in euro to build so-called public works and infrastructure. So that made their GDP look great because they were building highways and airports and all this. But the dirty little secret is they were borrowing money in denominations which they can't print. They can only print Turkish lira. They owe a ton of money. It's denominated in dollars and euros, and they're having a currency crisis. I was in Turkey in September of this year. It was 8-1 lira to dollar. In September, it's now about 13-1.
Gosh.
So if you read daily news stories from Turkish news sites, you will see what average people in Turkey are doing to protect themselves. And so prices adjust. It's not like you can fly to Istanbul today and buy a Rolex really cheap or something. No, a Rolex is imported into Turkey and they just adjust the price. But you can go buy wholly Turkish products, agricultural products, food, spices, that sort of thing, very, very cheap. So I think Turkey is the canary in the coal mine. If you think it can't happen here, that's a very ahistorical account. So I think worrying about inflation is your number one job right now.
That's very well put. And yes, one can look at past examples in Weimar Germany or even Zimbabwe, but yeah, with what's happening in Turkey with the lira, that's a very contemporaneous example. So one can see what's happening in real time there. I think for us as real estate investors, oftentimes we're positioning ourselves in just about the best way possible that we can to benefit from inflation. If we can't change it ourselves, we might as well align our interests with what monetary policy and fiscal policy is doing to create inflation. In fact, Jeff, I coined something called the inflation triple crown. When you get a cash flowing property with a long-term fixed interest rate mortgage, you benefit from asset price inflation. You benefit from debt debasement because the bank doesn't ask to be repaid in inflation adjusted dollars, so it actually erodes the weight of your debt. And then thirdly, there's cash flow enhancement because your cash flow typically outpaces inflation, since a real estate investor's biggest expense, that mortgage principal and interest, stays fixed for all 30 years. So it is a benefit to us, but obviously inflation is not of benefit to many people. And part of the calculus there, Jeff, is that oftentimes wages don't keep up proportionally with inflation. What are your thoughts with where else inflation is problematic, whether that be in certain sectors, whether it's goods or services, or whether it not be in inflation being able to keep up commensurately with inflation this decade?
Certainly in the last year or so, unless you've gotten at least a 6 or 7% raise at work, or your business has produced 6 or 7% more income, you're not even treading water. So I think we have to start with that understanding. It's very tough out there. Some of this inflation is caused by supply chain issues from COVID lockdowns. To be fair, it's not all fiscal and monetary policy. Some of it is simply there's less supply of some goods and services that the world demands because of COVID lockdowns. You send everybody home, shut down the world, or shut it down in large part for a period of months, and you have to expect that to happen. So in some cases, it's just simple supply outstripping demand. That applies to real estate too. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to be in Boise, Idaho. And if you read about Boise, it's absolutely crazy what's happened there to housing markets.
Yeah.
People have moved to Phoenix. Certain markets in Florida have just absolutely exploded with people trying to get away from COVID lockdowns. That's just part of, I guess, due diligence in trying to take some risks and understand the world and decide where to invest. I mean, that's personal or individualized thing. But for my own part, looking back, you think of trying to be frugal and trying to be someone who buys goods for cash and doesn't get into debt and doesn't use credit cards and has a modest mortgage and that sort of thing. And I look at my own life and I think most of my life I've tried to purchase, let's say, used cars for cash in that $15,000 range. And you start to think, wow, gosh, who is this guy who's out there spending $800 a month on a fancy car payment? But, over the last couple of years anyway, that might have been the more rational play from a pure dollars and cents perspective. And so people like me, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners, sometimes we let our view of the world, not necessarily ideology, but our temperament, our view of the world. I guess I sort of come from a background or family where everything was very frugal and you thought that you should pay cash as you go for everything.
Same.
And maybe that has cost me somewhat in my personal finances over the last 20 years, because how you think the world works always needs to be checked against how it is working.
And it's so easy to revert to what our parents taught us when oftentimes people never had much of a formal financial education. I think that's why a lot of these myths persist, like be a saver rather than a debtor. But it's actually a more nuanced conversation than that. But we're talking about the state of the economy and understanding that it was in 2020, we really statistically had a short, quick, steep crash, with the definition of a recession being quarter over quarter, 2 consecutive quarters of year over year economic contraction. What do you think about the possibility of a double dip recession, and could inflation lead to that? What are the prospects of a double dip recession, and what might lead to such a thing, Jeff? Are we really out of the woods yet?
You have to understand that recessions are like stock markets. They're like housing markets. We look at them in nominal terms. When Uncle Sam comes along in response to the COVID outbreak in March and April of 2020, or our knowledge of it, and the Fed joins in and throws a lot of new money and credit at the problem, it's easy to paper over what ought to look like a significant violent downturn in the economy. But you have to understand that shocks like COVID, like 9/11, like the outbreak of war, these are always inherently deflationary. When people don't know what's going on, when they're worried, they immediately start increasing their cash balances. They don't know if they're going to lose their job. They don't know if they might have to move to another city and need a down payment for an apartment or a down payment for a new house. That's deflationary. When you send people home from work, when they aren't driving as much, when they aren't going out to eat as much, when they aren't traveling as much, when they aren't using hotels, they aren't buying as much gas, all of that is hugely deflationary. That's the natural consequence of any shock like COVID. And it's very, very healthy, because that's the signal that the marketplace needs for what kinds of goods and services need to be supplied at that moment. And so when people hold on to money, that makes other people's money worth more, because it reduces demand for goods and services. So that increases the purchasing power of your dollars. My argument is that's very, very healthy. And governments and central banks shouldn't try to fight that, which is exactly what they do. They try to fight the natural tendency during a shock, which is deflationary and recessionary. So they try to pump it up, and pump it up they did, with a lot of stimulus and a lot of credit. Does that mean that we are out of a recession? I'm not so sure. It does on paper nominally, but look, there's no question that in 2020, the US economy, really the worldwide economy, but the US economy produced fewer goods and services. Of course, we sent people home. By definition, an economy is judged by its productivity, by what it produces, how much of it, what quality, and at what cost. In other words, does it do so efficiently? This idea that we weigh or judge our economy based on consumption is crazy, because the government can create artificial demand and artificial consumption through fiscal and monetary policy. But it doesn't matter if the Fed or Joe Biden and Congress gave everybody $10 million into their bank accounts directly tomorrow, and somehow that could be done evenly, instantaneously to everybody in America. Prices would just adjust.
That doesn't produce anything.
There wouldn't be any new goods or services in existence as a result. There wouldn't be any more houses. There wouldn't be any more cars. There wouldn't be more food. So the question's not how much money exists in the economy, how much people are spending. The question is how productive and how efficient an economy is. And clearly, our economy is less productive and less efficient than it was before COVID. That's just a fact. So I don't really care about the numbers that they use to gloss over it.
That is production being a more viable way to measure economic health rather than consumption is. Uncertainty is deflationary. It makes people want to stay at home and not spend on services and not go anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one, of course, bright side was that all the industries surrounding people being at home benefited. In other words, a lot of people got into remodeling. A lot of people got into gardening. A lot of people got into landscaping, improving their houses in whatever way, because all of a sudden they were home a lot more. And they said, hey, I got to be in this box for 16 hours a day, so let's fix it up. But what really makes me sad about the lockdowns more than anything, it's one thing, you look at some of these celebrities and they might have a suburban home with a swimming pool and this and that, and they have food being delivered to them, or they have Walmart delivery or Grubhub or whatever it might be. Imagine you were a very, very poor person. You live in a tenement high rise in a big urban setting. So let's say in Detroit, and you have 3 kids and you're all in a small apartment, and the only place you can go outside is down an elevator and out into a concrete jungle. And maybe there's a convenience store down the street or something like that. Well, for those people, stay at home was a very different experience. And so we shouldn't forget the human costs of these lockdowns. It's not just economic.
There are a bunch of great points there. And yeah, really that condition widened the disparity between the haves and the have-nots from a quality of life perspective. Well, Jeff, you do a lot of work there at the Mises Institute, presiding over that organization to help champion things like free markets. If someone wants to learn more about you and what you do, they sure have been opened up to your line of thinking today. What's the best way for someone to engage with what you do there at Mises, Jeff?
Follow us on Twitter at Mises.org, or follow me on Twitter at Jeff Deist, all one word. And, if you have interest in economics as an investor, otherwise, you can sign up for our emails or whatever you want and consume as much or as little material as you might want from us.
Jeff, do you have any final thoughts or any parting thoughts, especially for real estate investors, as we kind of have this robust entrepreneurship in our hearts a lot of times, especially when it comes to things like freedom and property rights? And you can learn more about Jeff in those resources that he left there in the show notes to today's episode. You have any final thoughts there, Jeff?
My final thought would be that it's not just the numbers. There's a perception that economists or people interested in economics is all just this kind of homo economicus, hyper-rational human who's just out there trying to maximize and make profit. And so a lot of people say, well, it doesn't really make sense to own real estate because if you just have 1 or 2 properties, including your own, you don't have the economies of scale when it comes to having to hire plumbers or maintenance or yard that a big conglomerate does. And so it makes more sense from a pure dollars and cents perspective to have a system more like Switzerland or Germany, where something along the lines of 70 or 80% of people rent, and the owner class has the aforementioned economies of scale. But I think that's missing something very important and very human and actually very American, which is this desire to have a little piece of something. And so that's subjective. How you value that personally, owning your home as opposed to renting, that's not something that can necessarily be measured in dollars and cents. That's a subjective feeling of personal satisfaction. I think America's a big country. There's plenty of room out there. It never made, especially in a digital era, sense for us to be so crowded together in really expensive cities like New York and San Francisco and Seattle and Los Angeles with all these roommates and congested traffic and high real estate prices. That never made real sense. And so I think the idea of people owning a home or actually owning some earth, some property below them, gives them a stake and an investment in caring about their neighborhoods and crime and the well-being of their children in the future in a way that renting maybe doesn't. And so I do think that apart from the economics, that homeownership's a healthy thing and a good thing and something that people ought to view not just in pure dollars and cents terms.
Jeff, that's very well stated. With developments that began to occur about 2 years ago, that stereotypical notion of having a home in the suburbs with a white picket fence has perhaps never been more desirable in recent times. Again, you can learn more about the work that Jeff Deist does at Mises.org. Jeff, it's been a great and enlightening chat. Thanks so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you, Keith. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, good perspective from Jeff Deist. For learning more, again, start there at Mises.org. With a big announcement today, go to the new GRE Marketplace and create an account. That ought to be live and ready to go. A number of valuable disparate resources are now all combined in one place there. And once you've registered there, you can set up a profile if you want to, but you'll have access to all of our turnkey providers and other providers, including sample properties and pro formas and their contact information. And then again, Andrea, that runs operations here at GRE, shot videos with many of the property managers in these markets. She interviewed them, and that way you can see if the property management company resonates with you before you go ahead and add more property to your portfolio. That's the big announcement today. Take the real estate knowledge that you have, make it actionable, and build real wealth. And if you're newer to real estate investing and you haven't started yet, but yet you've done some learning, well, I would encourage you to get started, and that is when the real learning begins, after all. Most everyone that has been, I would say, pointed in the right direction with real estate investing, they are glad that they got started. You can either live the life of your fears or the life of your dreams. That decision really is up to you. And with the run-up that's happened in real estate prices in the last year plus, although you need to acknowledge that's certainly better than usual times, this is really letting real estate investors live the life of their dreams now with 5 ways that real estate pays. Until next week, go to gremarketplace.com, register, and get started there. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.